What if the world's richest man walked into a college classroom, and nobody recognized him? Now imagine this. A strict professor mocks him in front of the whole class, only to be stunned when he steps up to the board and solves a problem no one else could. This isn't a movie script, it actually happened. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. The lecture hall at Easton University was packed to the walls. Students leaned forward in their seats, notebooks open, eyes focused on the woman at the front of the room. Professor Caroline Hughes didn't just speak, she declared. Her voice had the crisp edge of someone used to being right and never being questioned. It was the start of the university's new public lecture series, Business and the Mind, a critical conversation. That afternoon, Hughes was tackling the topic head-on with her usual fire. On the whiteboard behind her, in bold letters, she had written, "Why we mistake wealth for wisdom." About 5 rows from the back, a man sat quietly, dressed in faded jeans and a navy hoodie. He didn't look like he belonged. He was older than the others, mid-40s, maybe 50, with a kind of quiet presence that made him invisible in a room full of energy. His hood was pulled low, his face shadowed just enough to avoid second glances. Professor Hughes paced as she talked. "We live in an era," she said, "where business celebrities are treated like prophets. Take Elon Musk, for example." A few heads turned toward the back at the mention of the name. But the man in the hoodie didn't move. "He's hailed as a genius, a visionary," Hughes went on. "But let's be honest, he's a businessman. He didn't write the code. He didn't invent the science. He leveraged people, and somehow, we now worship the man instead of the minds behind the work." A murmur rippled through the room. A student in the front row cautiously raised her hand. "But, isn't innovation also a form of intelligence, Professor?" Hughes didn't miss a beat. "Not if it comes without understanding. You can't call someone brilliant just because they hire brilliant people. That's not intelligence. That's opportunity." The man in the hoodie sat perfectly still. His fingers tapped lightly against his notebook, the only outward sign he was even listening. Hughes stepped forward, folding her arms. "Let me ask you this. If Elon Musk sat in this room today, and I gave him a basic problem in real analysis, could he solve it?" She paused for effect, her eyes narrowing. "I'd bet my tenure he couldn't." The class chuckled, nervously at first, then louder as they fed off her confidence. "No offense," Hughes added with a smile that wasn't quite kind. "But some people are just lucky. And we need to stop mistaking luck for brilliance." The man in the back shifted slightly in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. No one noticed. Another student, a quiet boy with glasses, raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again. Hughes saw. "Did you want to say something?" He shook his head. "It's nothing." She turned back to the board. "Then let's keep moving." But from the back of the room, someone was watching, not out of anger, not even surprise, just that quiet, steady patience of someone who's heard it all before. And for now, he said nothing. Professor Hughes stood by the whiteboard, a blue marker in hand. With swift, confident strokes, she began drawing symbols and functions, filling up the space with a dense mathematical problem that looked more like a puzzle from another universe than something meant for a college lecture. "This," she said, capping the marker with a snap, "is a real challenge, a boundary problem in nonlinear differential equations. It's what I consider the minimum threshold for understanding advanced mathematics." She turned back to the class with a cold smile. "I'd be very surprised if Mr. Musk, with all his flashy interviews and rocket launches, could even read this correctly, let alone solve it." A ripple of amusement moved through the rows of students. A few exchanged glances. Some smirked. Then she leaned forward, placing both hands on the desk. "Let's settle this, shall we? If anyone here truly believes Elon Musk deserves the level of respect he's been given, come up here. Prove it. Solve the problem." Silence fell like a thick curtain. You could almost hear the sound of pens being set down. No one moved. Even the students who had been nodding earlier were suddenly quiet. Eyes darted across the room, checking who might be foolish enough to take the bait. Professor Hughes straightened, her voice sharp but smooth. "That's what I thought." A few soft chuckles echoed. And then one bolder laugh rang out from a boy near the front, a well-dressed student with a confident grin. "Marketing and memes," he said under his breath, loud enough for a few to hear. "That's all the guy's got." Some students laughed with him. Others just looked down, unsure whether to join in. In the back row, the man in the hoodie slowly unfolded his hands from his lap. His knuckles were pale for just a second before he relaxed them again. Then he stood up, not hurried, not dramatic, just steady, like someone who had made a quiet decision. All heads turned. The laughter died instantly. "I'd like to give it a try," he said calmly, his voice low but clear. Even Hughes blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" He stepped out from behind the last row of chairs, moving toward the board with an unhurried pace. He didn't look at anyone, just walked. "I'd like to attempt the solution," he repeated, "with your permission." The professor tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And you are?" He paused for a brief moment, then offered a small smile. "Just a student." Something about the way he said it made the room go still again. Hughes gave a tight nod and stepped aside. "Be my guest," she said, voice laced with something between suspicion and curiosity. The man picked up the marker without hesitation. His grip was firm but relaxed, as though he'd done this many times before. He looked at the equation once, twice, then started to write. For the next several minutes, you could hear nothing but the soft squeak of the marker gliding over the whiteboard. No one whispered, no one moved. Even the boy who had laughed earlier sat frozen, eyes wide. The man didn't rush. He made space between steps, explained with a few quiet notes to the side of the main line, notations that only someone deeply familiar with the problem would think to write. And then he stopped. He set the marker down, turned around, and said, almost gently, "There's a cleaner way to approach the boundary conditions. But this version should be sufficient for now." A moment passed, then another. Finally, one student, sitting close to the front, muttered, "Wait, he actually solved it." Professor Hughes took a few steps toward the board. Her eyes scanned the equations, moving faster now, reading through every step like someone trying to prove herself wrong and failing. The room held its breath. She didn't speak, not at first. Then, with a voice that had lost its sharpness, she said, "That's correct." The air in the room shifted. Some students leaned back in their chairs, stunned. A few exchanged looks, whispering now for an entirely different reason. The man gave a small nod and turned to walk back to his seat. But just before reaching the last row, he stopped. He turned halfway toward the front of the class and, in that same quiet tone, said, "Understanding isn't always loud. Sometimes, it just shows up when you stop expecting it." Then he sat down, and for the first time all day, Professor Hughes had nothing to say. The marker moved across the board like a violin bow sliding across string, measured, graceful, but deliberate. The man in the hoodie didn't fumble. He didn't hesitate. Each stroke of the marker carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived with equations longer than most people lived with their spouses. Students leaned in. At first, it was simple curiosity. Then it became something else. He started by reframing the problem, not by attacking the equation head-on but by simplifying its boundary conditions. A few students raised their brows, surprised by the shift in approach. Instead of brute forcing through the complexity, he peeled back the layers like he was folding laundry, casually, neatly. A soft whisper moved across the room. Then another. "Wait, I've seen that guy before. No way, it can't be, right?" In the third row, a girl with dark curls leaned forward, squinting. "Hold on, that looks like... No, that can't be." Up front, Professor Hughes stood with her arms crossed, lips pursed, her eyebrow arched at first, like someone expecting a clever mistake she could use to make a point. But her stance began to shift. Minute by minute, her smile tightened, then faded, because the man wasn't just solving the problem. He was dissecting it, and he wasn't showing off, he was teaching. For every calculation, he added a line of commentary in the margin, clarifying assumptions, showing alternate paths. He wasn't just right, he was thorough. He finished the first method in under 10 minutes, then paused. Without turning, he added a second approach, this one using a Laplace transform variation that took a completely different route to the same answer. It was shorter, more elegant, and included a small insight into error sensitivity Hughes hadn't mentioned earlier. The third method came after a brief glance at the audience. It was shockingly simple, using a visual approach to the boundary that reframed the entire question, so intuitive it made the original problem look overcomplicated. By now, phones were out, discrete snapshots, a video clip or two. Fingers tapped screens as students searched photos online. The girl in the third row whispered, "That's him. I swear to God, that's Elon Musk." Another student leaned over, jaw half dropped. "No way, but it looks just like him." Same voice too. Murmurs swelled into low chatter. Hughes didn't stop them this time. She couldn't take her eyes off the board. When the man finally set the marker down, he stepped back with the calm of someone who had done what he came to do. No flourish, no mic drop, just silence. He looked at the professor, then at the class. "There are always different ways to reach understanding," he said quietly. "Sometimes, the hardest part isn't solving the problem, it's seeing it clearly." Not a sound in the room. The man nodded once and walked slowly back toward his seat, leaving the whiteboard behind, covered in answers, alternatives, and insights no one in that room had expected to see. And just before sitting down, he adjusted the sleeve of his hoodie. For the first time, everyone saw it, barely showing beneath the cuff, a sleek, familiar watch. The kind you don't buy. The kind that's made for you. Whispers rose to full-blown realization, spreading through the room like wildfire. Students turned to each other, wide-eyed. The boy who had laughed earlier sat frozen, mouth slightly open, and behind the professor, the board stood as silent proof. Elon stood still for a breath, letting the room sit in that raw, disbelieving silence. Then, calmly, he reached up and pulled back the hood of his gray sweatshirt. His hand moved to the thin-framed glasses perched low on his nose, slipping them off with the ease of a man who'd done this 100 times before. "My name is Elon Musk," he said simply. Gasps rippled through the room like wind through dry leaves. A few students froze mid-text. One girl nearly dropped her phone. For half a second, the lecture hall held its breath. Then someone in the back clapped once, soft and uncertain. Another joined, and then another, until the room erupted in thunderous applause. Some students even standing, others looking around as if trying to confirm this was really happening. The girl from earlier, now certain, nodded with wide eyes, whispering to the student next to her, "I told you, I knew it." Professor Hughes stood frozen at the front of the class, the folder in her hand clutched tightly, fingers white at the knuckles. Her face had gone a deep shade of red, not from embarrassment alone, but from the shock of realizing she had, quite publicly, misjudged the very man she had tried to discredit. Elon took a moment before speaking again, letting the room settle. His voice was calm but carried a quiet authority that pulled the entire space back into focus. "I came here," he began, "because I was curious. I wanted to hear what people thought of me when my name wasn't attached to every sentence. When I wasn't expected." A young man toward the front raised his hand hesitantly, then spoke without waiting. "But why the disguise? You could have walked in as yourself, and we would have listened." Elon smiled. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "Sometimes, when you're known, people only hear your name, not your words. I wanted to know what you'd say about me when you thought I wasn't listening. I wanted to understand what criticism felt like when it was honest, not curated." The class sat quietly, many still unsure whether to feel guilty, inspired, or just stunned. Professor Hughes stepped forward, clearing her throat. Her voice was low, carefully measured. "Mr. Musk, I want to be clear. I didn't intend to offend. My goal was to emphasize the value of foundational knowledge, of academic rigor." Elon nodded, not with sarcasm but with a kind of generous patience. "I believe in education," he replied, deeply. "I wouldn't be here otherwise. But education is about lifting people up, not tearing them down for their non-traditional paths. Intelligence doesn't always come with credentials. Sometimes it comes with bruises, or experiments, or failure." Hughes looked down briefly, her voice cracked ever so slightly. "I suppose I let my frustration with the culture of celebrity cloud my message." He didn't press her. There was no triumph in his tone, no ego, just understanding, and something more, empathy. It's easy to judge people we've never met, Elon said, turning back toward the students. But every person you ridicule, every success you call luck, remember, there's a journey behind that. Often invisible, often painful. A student in the middle row, maybe 19, stood up without being called. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. Sir, I think I learned more in these last 20 minutes than I have all semester. The room went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't disbelief. It was respect. And Elon, standing among them not as a billionaire, not as a tech icon, but as a quiet man in a hoodie, gave her a single nod. He didn't need to say anything else. Because in that moment, he already had. The room had changed. What once echoed with polite obedience now buzzed with something deeper, curiosity. Respect. And for some, a quiet reckoning. The air no longer felt stiff. It felt charged. Students who had sat back earlier now leaned forward. Not just to see better, but to listen better. A girl in the second row tapped her friend's arm, whispering, "This is crazy. I can't believe it's actually him." Elon stood at the front, still in the same plain sweatshirt and jeans, still holding the dry erase marker that had, minutes earlier, silenced the entire class. He didn't look smug. He didn't act like a billionaire with something to prove. He just looked calm, steady, grounded. The first question came from a boy near the windows. Voice hesitant. Sir, do you ever feel like failing is permanent? Like, you mess up once, and that's it? Elon's answer came without hesitation. I've failed more times than I've succeeded. He said, there were nights I slept on the floor of my factory, wondering if I'd made a mistake risking everything. I've been laughed at, pushed aside, told no by people who wouldn't even look me in the eye. But none of that is permanent, unless you let it be. Another hand went up, this time, a young woman with a slight tremble in her voice. But what if you're not rich? Or famous? What if you're just a person trying to be heard? Elon paused. He didn't deflect. He didn't smile his way around it. Instead, he said, that's the hardest part. When no one listens. When your voice feels like it doesn't matter. I've seen people smarter than me, more disciplined, get passed over because they didn't fit the mold. But if you show up, day after day, and you do the work better than anyone expects you to, eventually, someone notices. And when they do, everything shifts. A student sitting close to the center, young, black, probably no older than 20, raised his hand slowly. His voice was steady. But what if they never notice? What if the system is built to never let people like us through? The room fell quiet again. Elon met his gaze. Then you build your own door. He said quietly, I know it sounds cliché, but I mean it. I didn't come from wealth. My first startups were laughed out of the room. But I kept building. When they ignored me, I worked twice as hard. Eventually, even the loudest voices can't ignore results. I wish I could say it's fair, it's not. But you can still make it undeniable. For a moment, even the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum more softly. Another student, this time a woman with a pixie cut and a fierce look in her eyes, turned toward the front. Professor Hughes, she said, not with disrespect, but with quiet weight. If Mr. Musk hadn't revealed who he was today, would you have still dismissed him? The class turned with her. All eyes shifted to Professor Caroline Hughes. She had been still for several minutes, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Now, she looked up. Her voice, when it came, was much softer than before. I don't know, she said. Honestly, I'm not sure I would have changed my view. The girl nodded once, like she expected that answer. And Elon, he didn't flinch. He didn't grin in victory or call her out. He simply said, that's why I came. Because it shouldn't take a name for someone to be seen. Professor Hughes glanced down at her lecture notes, then slowly set them aside. No one asked another question right away. They didn't need to. Something heavier than academic pride was shifting in that room, something that couldn't be captured in textbooks or office hours. The lecture hall had turned into a courtroom, but not in the legal sense. It was a trial of assumptions, of ego, of the ways we measure value in people. And for once, someone on the receiving end had gotten the chance to speak without being cut off. When the bell rang, no one moved, no one packed their bags. They just sat there, absorbing the kind of lesson that didn't come with a grade. And Elon? He stood by the board, quietly looking out at them. Not as a guest, not as a name, but as a mirror. The energy in the room had shifted. Not just softened but deepened. What began as a rigid lecture filled with academic ego had become something else entirely, something human. Elon remained at the front of the class. Though he no longer held the spotlight the same way. He wasn't lecturing or posturing. He was just answering, listening, sharing. The weight of his name had settled into the background. What remained was a man, worn with experience, speaking not as a mogul but as someone who remembered what it felt like to be unseen. A hand went up from the back, shaky, uncertain. The girl stood slowly, hugging her notebook against her chest. Her voice cracked before she even spoke. I was gonna drop out this semester, she said, blinking back tears. I kept telling myself I wasn't smart enough, that I didn't belong here. Every time I walked into this room, I felt smaller. But today, I don't know. For the first time, I feel like maybe I could still make it. The room fell into a hush so complete. You could hear the scratch of someone's sleeve against their desk. Elon nodded gently, his eyes warm. Thank you for saying that, he said. You're not alone. Most of us, at some point, feel like we're pretending to be something we're not. But let me tell you, what matters most isn't where you started. It's how stubborn you are about moving forward. The girl sat down, wiping at her eyes, and a few others around her did the same. Then, Elon turned toward Professor Hughes. His voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't cold, it was steady. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone, he said, but I do believe that classrooms should never make someone feel small just because they don't speak the same way, or look the part, or learn in the way we expect. Professor Hughes hadn't moved for some time. Her posture, usually stiff with authority, now seemed drained of it. She blinked slowly, removed her glasses, and let out a long breath. I suppose I forgot, she said, her tone soft but audible. That teaching isn't just about formulas and theory. It's also about faith, in the potential of people we may not understand yet. No one said a word. Even the students who had chuckled earlier, who had scoffed when Elon first stood up, now looked down at their desks. Some fidgeting with pens, others just sitting still, like something was sinking in. Elon stepped back, folding his hands in front of him. I've had the privilege of building rockets, he said, but nothing moves faster than judgment, especially in rooms like this. The truth is, genius doesn't always wear a suit, and kindness isn't always loud. There was a stillness that lingered for a long, meaningful moment. Then, a single student stood, not to speak, not to question, just to applaud. Another followed, then two more, and before long, the entire classroom was on their feet, clapping, not wildly, not out of awe for celebrity, but with quiet intensity, like something had been released. Like some unspoken pressure had finally been named. Elon didn't bow, he didn't smile with victory. He just nodded once, eyes scanning the room. Professor Hughes remained seated, her hands resting in her lap, eyes glistening. She looked up at Elon, her voice almost too quiet to hear. Thank you, she said, for showing up. Elon gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. Thank you, he replied, for listening. And just like that, the moment closed. But it would linger, maybe longer than any lecture they'd ever sat through. The morning light filtered gently through the tall windows of the university hall, casting long shadows across the polished floors. A new kind of anticipation buzzed through the classroom, not the usual scramble to review notes or find a good seat, but something quieter, more personal. The name on the email had been unmistakable. Subject line: Open discussion on arrogance in education and the limits of knowledge. Professor Hughes stood near the front, not behind the podium this time, but beside it. Her posture was different, less rigid, more grounded. There was no stack of lecture notes in her hand, no slides waiting on the screen, just a single chair set beside another. Elon entered the room a few minutes before the start, dressed plainly once again, but no longer anonymous. This time, students didn't ignore him. They greeted him with nods, some with small smiles, still a bit unsure, but no longer dismissive. He took the seat next to her without ceremony. The class settled. Professor Hughes stepped forward, cleared her throat, then looked out across the room with something that hadn't been in her eyes yesterday: humility. I owe you all something I should have offered a long time ago. She began. An apology. Yesterday, I let my pride speak louder than my responsibility. I confused my role as a teacher with the need to be right. And in doing so, I may have made some of you feel smaller, invisible, or unworthy. That was wrong. The room was still. A few students looked at each other. One or two lowered their gaze. She nodded toward Elon. Mr. Musk has agreed to join today's discussion, not as a guest of honor, but as a peer in reflection. Elon leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. This isn't about winning or losing an argument, he said. It's about asking a question we don't ask enough in places like this. How do we build environments where students aren't afraid to be wrong in front of authority? There was a pause. Then a hand went up. A girl in the second row. Her hair tied back, her voice trembling at first. I remember last year, she said, I shared a project idea that didn't follow the standard format. The professor, I won't say who, told me it sounded like science fiction and asked if I even understood the basics. She swallowed hard. After that, I stopped speaking up. I thought maybe people like me weren't supposed to dream big. Today's the first time I've said that out loud. A quiet murmur rolled through the room. Another hand, a student sitting near the window. I've had professors dismiss my ideas just because they didn't fit their framework. It wasn't about right or wrong, it was about tone, or how fast I spoke, or whether I cited the exact scholar they wanted. Elon listened, nodding slowly. He turned to Hughes. How do we teach students to question? He asked gently, when we punish them for thinking differently. The professor didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then back at the class. I've spent most of my life believing that structure was safety, she said quietly, that rules and form were the guardrails of truth. But I forgot that those same structures can become walls if we're not careful, walls that keep out the very people education is supposed to lift. Then came the question no one expected. If I want to do better, she asked, would you let me? Silence. Not out of resistance, but something closer to consideration. Then, from the back, a voice, calm and clear. We've always been waiting for that. A few heads turned, some nodded. Slowly, the air in the room changed again, not with applause or celebration, but with something quieter, trust, beginning to rebuild. Professor Hughes looked around, her eyes meeting faces she hadn't really seen before. I don't want to teach like I used to, she said, but I'll need your help. Another student raised a hand. Then let's start here, she said. Let's make this classroom a place where it's okay to be uncertain. Elon glanced around the room, then added, uncertainty is where ideas begin. It's not weakness, it's the start of everything that matters. And in that space, not guided by a syllabus or a test, learning happened in its purest form. The university's main auditorium hadn't seen this much energy in years. Rows filled early, students huddled shoulder to shoulder. Faculty mixed among them. A small sign outside read, Open Forum. Bias in academia. But it didn't capture the weight of what was about to happen. The event was live-streamed across the campus network, with students tuning in from dorm rooms, coffee shops, and even nearby high schools that had heard about what had unfolded the previous week. At the center of the stage sat two chairs, plain and equal. One held Professor Caroline Hughes, the other, Elon Musk. But this wasn't the same Professor Hughes from last week, the one with sharp critiques and sharper tone. Today, she sat calmly, both hands resting on her lap. Her eyes scanned the audience slowly, not in control, but in recognition. She was the first to speak. I used to think that once you reached this stage, tenure, publications, lectures, you were supposed to have the answers, she said, her voice steadier than expected. But the truth is, I stopped asking the right questions a long time ago. The room quieted. She continued, last week, I let my bias dictate my words. Not my training, not my data, just my own assumptions. And in doing so, I made someone feel small, someone who, by all accounts, came to this classroom to learn. Just like the rest of you. She turned to Elon briefly, then back to the audience. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. No applause. Just silence, respectful, absorbing. Elon leaned slightly toward the microphone. His tone, as always, was calm and measured. Mistakes aren't the end, he said. They're just the start of a better version of ourselves, if we let them be. He paused, then looked out at the students. I'm not here because I'm a billionaire or because I started a company. He said, I'm here because I once sat in a classroom like this, full of questions and doubts. And because someone once told me I wasn't good enough. That I was too much of a dreamer. A hand went up in the back. A freshman, maybe 18, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big. Nervous. Mr. Musk, the student asked, what if you're not rich or famous? What if you're just a regular kid, and the system treats you like you don't belong? How do you speak up without getting crushed? Elon didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, as if the weight of the question demanded he feel it fully. You don't need a spotlight, he finally said, you just need a voice. One question, one sentence, that says, I see things differently, can change the mood of an entire room. He let that sit for a moment. The hardest part is not being heard, he added, but the second hardest is staying silent. This time, the room did applaud, not a loud, flashy burst, but a rising tide of agreement. Not for celebrity, not for status, but for something deeper, recognition. A student in the front stood up. She turned not to Elon, but to the faculty in the front row. We've spent years learning how to answer your questions, she said. Maybe now it's time we learn how to ask our own. Professor Hughes smiled, an honest, tired, yet proud smile. The moderator, a faculty dean, stepped forward and cleared his throat. There's something we'd like to announce, he said. Starting next semester, the university will offer a new elective, critical thinking and intellectual humility in higher education. It was proposed by Professor Hughes and approved unanimously. The announcement landed with the kind of weight that doesn't need fanfare. Heads turned. Some students looked genuinely stunned. A few faculty exchanged glances, some impressed, others perhaps humbled, as the crowd filed out slowly. The energy in the air was different than when they'd entered. Not electric, not frenzied, but thoughtful. In the hallway, 2 students whispered about signing up for the new class. Outside, a freshman sat alone under a tree, typing something on her phone. I asked a question today. My hands were shaking, but I did it. I think it mattered. And inside, as Elon walked toward the back exit, a janitor paused to hold the door open for him. I watched the whole thing, the man said, almost shyly. Elon nodded with a warm smile. Thanks for being here. The man shrugged. First time I've ever seen a professor say she was wrong. Elon paused, hand on the door. It won't be the last, he said, and with that, he stepped outside, into the kind of cool, quiet morning that didn't need words to feel different. In the days following the public forum, the university found itself in unfamiliar territory. The usual quiet corridors and lecture halls were now buzzing with conversations that didn't center around grades or midterms. Instead, they circled around words like bias, authority, humility. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It had become a movement. But, as with all shifts, not everyone moved in the same direction. Across campus, opinions split quickly. Some faculty praised Professor Hughes for her courage and honesty, calling the event a long overdue reckoning for academic culture. Others, however, whispered behind office doors, suggesting she had let the crowd take over the classroom. Next thing you know, one senior professor muttered in the faculty lounge, we'll be handing out degrees based on charisma. Inside the philosophy department, a heated debate broke out after a junior professor posted a message on the internal board. Respect is earned through curiosity, not credentials. It struck a nerve. Half applauded. The rest questioned whether such language threatened the credibility of scholarship. Professor Hughes sat quietly in her office that afternoon, sunlight falling across her desk. A new email pinged in. She recognized the sender immediately, her old mentor, a man who once helped her publish her first paper. The subject line read, disappointed. She opened it. You've let sentimentality cloud your judgment. It said, you used to protect the rigor of this institution. Now, it seems you'd rather play to the crowd. This isn't teaching, it's theater. She read it twice. Then, slowly, she moved her cursor to the trash icon and clicked. No reply, just release. Elon had already left the campus that morning. No farewell ceremony, no cameras, no send-off. He'd left a single handwritten note behind. taped to the door of the seminar room. It read, "Every system can be repaired, but it starts with one person willing to say, 'I was wrong.'" Word spread fast. Someone snapped a picture of the note, and within hours, it was circulating on social media. Students began quoting it in class discussions. Some even wrote it in the margins of their notebooks. Meanwhile, the student forum erupted with reflections. A sophomore posted, "For the first time, I saw a professor admit a mistake, and it didn't make me lose respect. It made me listen harder." But the post that caught fire was titled, "The class that taught me brilliance doesn't need power to be heard." It came from a quiet girl in the back row who had never spoken up before. Her words were raw, unsure, but honest. She wrote, "I've always felt invisible here. But last week, someone who had every reason to speak loud chose to sit in silence first. And when he spoke, it wasn't to shine, it was to hold up a mirror." The post hit over 100,000 shares in less than a week. Inspired by the wave of energy, a small group of students formed a new initiative. They called it Classrooms Without Silence. Their mission was simple: bring in speakers from all walks of life, janitors, bus drivers, artists, single moms, anyone with a story worth hearing, regardless of degrees or titles. One of the founders explained, "If wisdom only came from textbooks, the world would be a very different place." Flyers started going up, faculty began volunteering to moderate sessions, and slowly, the idea that truth had many voices began to take hold. One particular photo became the quiet symbol of this change. Elon, standing at the whiteboard, mid-sentence, chalk in hand. Beside him, the solved equation. Someone had added a caption, "Don't underestimate quiet minds." The photo showed up on dorm walls. It appeared as a desktop background in at least one campus computer lab. Some students turned it into pins and handed them out during orientation week. A philosophy student wrote underneath it, "Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it just solves the problem and walks away." Professor Hughes saw the photo one evening as she left her office. It was posted on the community board next to a flyer for the upcoming Voices of the Unseen panel. She paused for a long moment, staring at the image, not at Elon, but at the chalkboard beside him. Then, without a word, she picked up a pen and scribbled something at the bottom of the flyer. "I'm listening." 1 month had passed since the forum. The classroom looked the same, rows of chairs, whiteboard up front, familiar rustling of notebooks, but something had shifted. It wasn't in the furniture. It was in the air, in the way students carried themselves, in the way Professor Caroline Hughes now stood before them. She opened that day's lecture with a question, her tone softer, more human than they'd ever heard from her before. "How many of you have ever felt afraid to ask a question in class?" A quiet pause followed. Then, hands started rising, slowly at first, then more confidently, almost half the room. Professor Hughes nodded, as if she'd been expecting it. "Me too," she said. The words landed gently, like a hand on the shoulder. A few students exchanged glances. Some smiled, unsure but encouraged. She didn't launch into a formula or a definition that morning. Instead, she began to speak, not to instruct, but to share. She talked about moments when she'd gotten things wrong in front of colleagues. Times she'd dismissed students because she didn't want to appear uncertain. The silence that followed her own mistakes. She even admitted that, for years, she feared losing control of her classroom if she let it become too open. "But what I've learned," she said, "is that control isn't the same thing as respect. And silence doesn't always mean agreement, it often means fear." From the back of the room, Michael, a soft-spoken student she had once brushed off mid-sentence, now sat at the front. He had since become her teaching assistant, not because he aced every test, but because he brought balance to the class. He listened. He asked the kind of questions that made people stop and think, not just recite. He'd grown into a quiet force, and Caroline had come to trust his instincts more than she ever expected. Classes now included guest speakers, none of them professors. One week, a mechanic walked in with grease-stained hands and told the class how he used geometry and problem-solving every day on the shop floor. Another week, a single mother spoke about raising 3 kids while working night shifts and earning her GED at 42. She spoke about resilience. about how learning to budget felt more like calculus than numbers on a spreadsheet. And one afternoon, a veteran who'd once struggled with PTSD shared how journaling and reading philosophy helped him understand himself better than therapy ever had. Students leaned forward. They didn't check their phones. They didn't whisper. Because, in those moments, the classroom was no longer about proving what you knew. It was about absorbing what you didn't. Late one evening, after grading papers in her office, Professor Hughes opened her inbox and saw a message that stopped her cold. Subject: Thank you. It was from Elon. I wanted to say thank you. Not for what you said, but for what you did after. You showed your students, and the rest of us, that change doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being willing to listen. She read it again, then closed her laptop and sat in the stillness of her office, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The following week, during a departmental meeting, the tone was less generous. One of her peers, a tenured historian, raised a concern. I'm not sure inviting non-academics into lectures is academically sound. What's next? Letting baristas teach logic? Caroline didn't bristle. She didn't fire back. She simply smiled, then said, if we only ever repeat what we already know, our students will never discover anything new. Silence followed. Not defensive, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. A pause that let her words breathe. That night, as she walked through campus under a stretch of quiet stars, Caroline thought about how strange it was. How the more she let go of control, the more her classroom came alive. How listening had taken more courage than lecturing ever did. She paused at a bulletin board where students had posted quotes and flyers. One corner still displayed the now familiar photo of Elon at the whiteboard. But next to it, a new one had been pinned. A handwritten note from a student. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who remember how it feels to be a student. Caroline reached out and adjusted the paper gently, her hand lingering for a moment. Then she stepped back, turned toward the quad, and kept walking, quiet, but not silent. Back in his office in Texas, Elon Musk sat by the window, watching the late afternoon sun stretch shadows across the edge of his desk. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, quiet and steady. Inside, the hum of the air conditioning barely masked the buzz of activity beyond the glass. His assistant peeked in, holding a tablet. Elon, you're trending again, she said with a small smile. The university video is everywhere. Students, professors, even journalists are writing about it. Want me to prep a response? He looked up, eyes calm. No need. She hesitated. You sure? This could be a great moment too. He shook his head gently. The most important thing already happened. No post from me could add to it. She nodded, stepping back as he turned again toward the window, the light catching the quiet conviction in his expression. Online, the story continued to ripple. But what people remembered wasn't the equation or the clean strokes of chalk across the board. It wasn't even the identity of the man who had solved it. It was the moment a room full of students realized that being right didn't require a title. That listening didn't make you weak. And that one quiet gesture could shift something far louder than applause. A year passed. At the university's graduation ceremony, the auditorium buzzed with families. Flashes from phones. The sound of folding chairs and practiced speeches. A senior stepped up to the podium. Nervous at first, then stronger as her voice found its footing. We were taught equations, yes, but we were also taught something rarer, she said, scanning the room. We were taught that silence isn't always a void. Sometimes, it's the loudest form of courage. Sometimes, choosing not to speak immediately gives others the space to be heard. Applause didn't come in a wave, it grew like a sunrise. Warm and slow, until the room stood. In the back, Professor Caroline Hughes stood quietly. Apart from the crowd, her once rigid posture had softened. Her hair had streaks of silver now, more than the year before. She no longer saw herself as the guardian of truth. She was simply a guide, a companion in the search. After the ceremony, she walked through the old lecture hall one more time. The chairs had been stacked, the board cleaned, but one wall remained different, preserved under a pane of glass. The equation Elon had written was gone, but someone had traced over where the chalk had been, just faint enough to feel like memory. Beneath it, engraved in a quiet, deliberate script were words he had once spoken to the class. Learning isn't about being better than others. It's about realizing everyone has something worth learning from. Caroline stood there for a long moment, her hand brushing lightly against the glass. She exhaled, almost smiling. Later that night, as Elon scrolled through his messages, one caught his eye. No subject line, just a name he didn't recognize. It was from a first-year student. "I just got told by my professor that I'm not smart enough to study engineering." The message read. There was a pause between sentences. Then, "Should I stay quiet?" Elon stared at the screen. His fingers hovered above the keyboard for just a second. Then he typed one word. "No." He hit send, then closed his laptop. Outside, the stars above Texas blinked in the clear sky, quiet, steady, and unafraid to shine. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not every classroom has four walls. And not every genius wears a name tag. Sometimes, the quietest voice in the room carries the weight of the most powerful message. What do you think? Have you ever felt overlooked because you didn't fit someone else's definition of smart? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more true stories that challenge assumptions and shine a light on the hidden power of ordinary moments.